Hello and welcome to Skyworld TV, and today we're going to be discussing if it's worth overclocking your budget gaming PC. Now, we've all seen those video guides for those high-end expensive gaming PCs with fancy i7 processors or premium GTX 1080 graphics cards.
You've whined for years about not being able to overclock the hell out of your PC. Well, quit your whining.
And while those PCs are great and all, those are overclocking guides for high-end gaming PCs. But what about the common folk like us, with low-end budget gaming PCs that are under $500? Is it worth the risk of overclocking our low-end hardware just for potential FPS gains with our pea-shooter gaming PCs? Well then, stay tuned for the video guide and for the badass overclocking benchmarks to follow. So first of all, can we even overclock low-end hardware in the first place? For reference, we'll take my $300 Volt gaming PC for example and see how far he can go in terms of overclocking. So for Volt, he primarily sports an Intel Pentium G4 600 and a Gigabyte GTX 1050 OC Edition graphics card. Now for the processor, the G4 600 on Volt is not overclockable, and that's going to go for the same for most budget Intel CPUs. And on top of that, if you did manage to get an overclockable Intel CPU, you have to get a motherboard that's more expensive to support overclocking on that as well. And you're probably also going to need an aftermarket CPU on top of that. So for the most part, when you're messing with a budget Intel gaming PC, you're probably not going to be able to overclock the CPU. But in good news, you can actually overclock any graphics card you have, which, just like the GTX 1050 OC Edition graphics card inside Volt, we're going to overclock that for this gaming PC. So if we take this $500 AMD Ryzen gaming PC for example, which sports an R5 1400 quad-core Ryzen processor and an RX 560, actually, both the GPU and CPU are overclockable since all Ryzen processors are overclockable, and it's on an affordable, cheap overclocking motherboard with the B350 chipset. And likewise, the GPU is also overclockable. But wait, there's more. One also really cool thing that comes with all Ryzen processors is the AMD Wraith CPU cooler, which actually has been reported to get some pretty good overclocking numbers for being a stock CPU cooler. So if you decide to build a budget Ryzen gaming PC, you can actually overclock both the CPU and GPU pretty well. And while that all sounds really good, let's go back to the original question. Would it even be worth overclocking your low-end hardware for those potential FPS gains? So for that, I took some benchmarks. So on Volt, I overclocked his GTX 1050 with a plus 171 MHz core clock speed and a plus 471 MHz memory clock speed on MSI Afterburner. And I'd say for a $100 graphics card, that's pretty good for what you're being offered compared to what you had last generation in terms of NVIDIA graphics cards. So for testing, I took 4 GPU intensive titles and paired each of them up on Volt and ran them on overclocked versus stock GPU settings. And on top of that, I added one temperature benchmark on one of the games, which was the most stressful game on this list, to also add some more conclusion to whether or not you should overclock your budget gaming PC. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the benchmarks.
Tin will employed to raise water from the Euphrates into the garden.
So as we can see from the gaming benchmarks, there's a clear benefit across the board from overclocking even just the graphics card in a $300 gaming PC. And now imagine if you had an AMD Ryzen gaming PC that was budget as well, and you decided to overclock the CPU on top of the GPU. You'd be getting even more FPS gains if you decided to do that, if your hardware could allow you to do that. And not to mention, you could probably do that for a really cheap, inexpensive price, like with the $500 Ryzen gaming PC that I showed earlier this video. And with that, luckily the temperature difference on Metro Last Light between stocked and overclock speeds on our GTX 1050 were actually pretty minimal. There's only a 3.4 degree difference between stocked and overclock speeds on the GTX 1050, which only means that that's a good thing to see because this is a low-end card that is very power efficient, that doesn't even require a cable from the power supply to run. And in fact, I'd actually argue that overclocking on higher end hardware might actually pose more risks because it has a greater margin for voltage increases and temperature increases because of the better hardware, whereas with lower end hardware, since it's so power efficient, you won't be dealing with crazy extreme wattages or crazy temperatures at all. So actually, I'd say overclocking lower end hardware is actually pretty safe. So should you overclock your budget gaming PC? If you want those extra FPS gains, then heck yeah, go for it. The risk is very minimal and you'll be getting some pretty noticeable benefits in game across the board. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching the video. Make sure to like, favorite, subscribe and all that. And this is the Scaffold TV channel, signing out.